Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into a concept that, well, everyone knows, but it's always causing debate. Freedom of speech.
That's right. It seems simple on the surface, but it's incredibly complex.
We've got this fascinating AI perspective here. AI view on freedom of speech. Use, abuse, and impact. Our mission, really, is to unpack this for you.
Yeah, give you a solid grasp of the whole thing, the history, the ideas behind it, the limits.
And crucially, why it's still such a flashpoint. We want to give you a kind of shortcut to understanding something so fundamental yet so contested.
And this AI view, it does a remarkable job pulling together so much history, philosophy, law. It's quite comprehensive.
It connects dots from, like, ancient Greece to today's internet arguments.
Exactly. It helps see the big picture, beyond just the headlines.
Okay, so let's get straight to it. What's the absolute core principle? What is freedom of speech, fundamentally?
Well, at its most basic, it's the freedom to say what you think, your ideas, your opinions, without worrying the government's going to shut you down, censor you, or, punish you legally.
Right. No fear of retaliation.
Exactly. But it's broader than just talking. The source makes that clear. It covers writing, printing, art, anything online.
So all forms of expression.
Pretty much. And crucially, it also includes the right to seek information, to receive it, and to share it across any border, any medium.
And I think you mentioned earlier it's not just about speaking, but also not speaking.
Yes, that's the negative right. You can't be forced to say something you don't believe, like saluting a flag if it goes against your principles.
Or being forced to listen, maybe?
That's part of it, too. And interestingly, while it's traditionally seen as protection from the government, there's this growing discussion now.
About private places, like universities.
Exactly. Should places like universities or even, say, big tech platforms uphold similar standards? It's a developing area.
That definitely shifts the focus. It's not just government anymore. But the idea itself, it goes way, way back, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Deep roots.
Yeah.
The source connects it to our actual human development, our ability for complex language. That's unique.
How so?
Well, language allowed us to think symbolically, to build cultures, societies, pass knowledge down. So the drive to express, to share ideas, it's kind of baked into us. It's not just a political add-on. It's fundamental to how we evolved socially and cognitively.
So it's almost a human need, not just a legal right invented recently.
That's a good way to put it. It's this long-standing impulse that different societies have dealt with in, well, very different ways.
And that brings us to the idea of universality. Is it the same everywhere?
Well, the aspiration is pretty universal. You see it enshrined in big international documents like Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, other treaties.
So on paper, yes.
On paper, yes. But in practice, huge variations. How it actually works day to day is shaped massively by local, culture, history, politics. What's totally fine to say in one place might get you into serious trouble somewhere else.
The source gives some great historical examples. Ancient Athens. They had specific words for free speech, right?
They did. Isagoria, equal right to speak in the assembly, and Parrhesia, speaking frankly, truthfully, even critically.
Yeah.
Sounds great. But
there were still limits.
Absolutely. You couldn't say, speak ill of the dead.
Yeah.
And, well, Socrates is the classic example of what could happen if you push boundaries too far, even in a place that valued debate.
And Rome was different again.
Yeah, in the Roman Republic, it was often seen more as a privilege for the elite, not necessarily a right for everyone.
Then you look at ancient China, a real mix of ideas.
A fascinating mix. Confucianism emphasized trustworthy, appropriate speech, while legalism was much more about state control. But you also had Maoist traditions valuing argumentation, Taoism promoting intellectual freedom, and intense debates during the Warring States period.
And Islamic traditions.
They viewed expression as sort of a divine grant, emphasizing truth-telling and tolerance. Concepts like hizbah, accountability, and nasiha, sincere advice, but again with clear limits against lying, backbiting, ridicule, and speech causing social discord or fitna.
Even pre-colonial Africa had systems for this.
Yes, absolutely. The source mentions various mechanisms for public discussion, ways for commoners to challenge royals, councils, even using things like drums for communication. It shows that societies found ways to manage expression long before formal Western legal systems dominated.
So the key takeaway is that the impulse is old and widespread, but the rules have always varied enormously.
Precisely. And it highlights that free speech isn't this isolated thing. It's tangled up with other freedoms.
Like freedom of assembly.
Or religion.
Exactly. Freedom of association, assembly, religion, the press, they all kind of support each other. They're seen as a foundation for a working democracy. People need to gather, organize, practice their faith, get information.
But its impact goes beyond just politics, right? Oh, totally. Think about personal relationships, arguments, how society progresses, education, art, media, even how we talk about really profound things like life and death. Speech is everywhere.
Okay, let's zoom in on how the idea developed more in Western thought and law. Where do things start to shift?
Well, the medieval period, the early Renaissance, that was often a time of suppression. The Church, the Inquisition, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of banned books, Galileo's story is a famous example.
But even then, there were sparks of resistance.
Yes, thinkers like Erasmus advocated for more intellectual freedom, and then Gutenberg's printing press. That was a game changer.
Spread ideas faster.
Massively faster. But of course, it also led to new attempts to control the spread of ideas. Licensing, censorship.
Then things really started moving in England.
Yes. You had figures like Sir Edward Coke pushing for parliamentary privilege, the right for MPs to speak freely in Parliament. The protestation of 1621 was a key moment.
And Milton's Areopagitica. That sounds important.
Hugely influential. It was a powerful argument against pre-publication censorship, needing government permission before printing something. Milton argued truth would win out in an open contest with falsehood.
And that led towards things like the English Bill of Rights.
It contributed. The Bill of Rights in 1689 formally protected free speech within Parliament, a major step.
Then the Enlightenment really kicked things into high gear.
Definitely. Sweden actually had one of the world's first freedom of the press laws in 1766, thanks to figures like Anders Cadenius. Then you have the French Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789.
And of course, the U.S. First Amendment in 1791.
Absolutely pivotal. These weren't just philosophical ideas anymore. They were being written into fundamental law.
And the 19th century builds on this, with thinkers like Mill.
John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is a cornerstone. He laid out powerful arguments for free speech, for finding truth, for individual development, for societal progress, and warning against the tyranny of the majority.
And social movements were using free speech too.
Critically. Think about abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, or women's suffrage campaigners like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah.
Their ability to speak out, publish, organize was essential to their causes.
So the 20th century and into our time, it feels like a continuation, but with new twists.
Very much so. You get landmark court cases in the U.S. like Brandenburg v. Ohio. Setting a high bar for restricting speech, it has to be likely to cause imminent lawless action.
And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights we mentioned earlier.
Right, setting that global standard, at least aspirationally. And then the internet. Digital media.
Yeah.
That's just blown the doors open in some ways.
More ways to speak, but also more ways to cause problems.
Exactly. Unprecedented reach, but also huge new challenges around censorship, misinformation, disinformation, how online platforms should moderate content. It's this recurring theme. New tech expands expression, and then society scrambles to figure out the new rules and controls.
Which brings us back to something you touched on. The law isn't the whole picture. Culture matters.
Hugely. The source really emphasizes this. You can have a law on the books, like the First Amendment, whose wording hasn't changed.
But how it's applied changes drastically.
Completely. Compare the Alien and Sedition Acts in early U.S. history, which stifled criticism of the government, to modern interpretations. The law evolves. But beyond that, the culture has to value free expression.
Mill's tyranny of the prevailing opinion.
Exactly. That's about social pressure, not just government censorship. You need a culture of tolerance, a willingness to hear uncomfortable ideas, for free speech to truly thrive beyond just the legal minimum.
Okay, let's pivot to the why. What are the big philosophical justifications for protecting free speech? Why do we value it so much?
The source breaks this down nicely. Broadly, you have instrumental arguments focusing on the good outcomes free speech produces, and intrinsic arguments saying speech is valuable in and of itself.
And underlying both is this idea that censorship assumes the censor is always right.
Yes, that silencing someone means you're assuming your own infallibility, which historically is a pretty dangerous assumption.
So let's start with those instrumental, outcome-focused arguments. The marketplace of ideas seems key here.
Right. This is the classic argument from Milton and especially Mill. The idea is that truth is most likely to emerge from open competition between ideas, even wrong ones.
How so?
Mill laid it out. Maybe the opinion you want to silence is actually true. Or maybe it's partially true, and you needed to get the whole picture. Or maybe the accepted view is true, But if you never have to defend it against challenges, it just becomes a dead dogma, something people believe without really understanding why. Challenging ideas keeps them vital.
But that marketplace idea isn't perfect, is it? The source raises some criticisms.
Definitely. It's a powerful metaphor, but reality is messier. People aren't always rational. We have biases. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, especially online with algorithms amplifying sensational stuff.
And power imbalances matter, too. Not everyone's voice carries the same weight in the marketplace.
Exactly. Some voices get amplified, others get drowned out or dismissed unfairly, what some call epistemic injustice. So the idea that truth just magically wins out in a free-for-all is, well, it's debated.
Okay, what's another major instrumental argument? Democracy seems big.
Huge. Thinkers like Alexander Michaeljohn argued that for democracy to work, the citizens, the voters, have to be informed. That means a free flow of information, especially about government and politics. You need to be able to criticize the government freely.
So people can make informed choices and hold power accountable.
Precisely. If the government controls the information, you don't really have self-governance.
And what about social stability and progress?
The argument there, linked to thinkers like Emerson and Mill again, is that free speech acts as a kind of safety valve. It lets people voice discontent peacefully, potentially preventing worse conflict.
And it allows challenging norms.
Yes, it allows challenging the status quo, bringing in diverse perspectives, which is essential for society to adapt and progress over time.
There's also an argument about checking government on this.
Right. Thinkers like Frederick Schauer have emphasized this. Open scrutiny, criticism from the press and public. It's a crucial check on potential corruption or overreach by those in power.
Okay, so those are arguments about the good results of free speech. What about the intrinsic arguments? Why is it valuable just on its own?
These focus more on the individual. People like Emerson, Mill, Thomas Scanlon argue it's essential for, well, being a person, for defining yourself, developing your personality, exercising your autonomy, your ability to think and choose for yourself.
So the state telling you what to think or say is disrespectful.
Fundamentally disrespectful of your capacity as an independent thinker. It's linked to human dignity. Some, like Jonathan Turley, argue it's tied to our cognitive development. Communication is vital for how we learn and think.
And thinker theories, what's that about?
That's an interesting angle from scholars like Shauna Schifrin. The idea is that we need to express our thoughts, put them out there, to properly evaluate them, to wrestle with ideas, and to function as moral agents. It helps explain why compelled speech, being forced to say something you don't believe, feels like such a violation. It interferes with that thinking process.
This seems like a good point to bring in Mill's harm principle. It sounds central to figuring out the limits.
It absolutely is. Mill's core idea on liberty was that the only legitimate reason for society or the government to interfere with someone's liberty, including their speech, is to prevent harm to others.
Your own good isn't enough reason.
Not according to Mill. Society shouldn't force you to do something just because it thinks it's good for you. Applied to speech, this means even offensive or unpopular ideas should generally be allowed, especially if there's time for counter-argument.
But there's an exception.
Yes. The famous exception is speech that poses a clear and present danger of imminent harm. His example was falsely shouting, "Fire!" in a crowded theater. Not the time for debate. Immediate panic and injury could result. Or inciting a mob waiting outside a corn dealer's house. Direct, immediate incitement to harm.
But harm itself, that idea has evolved, hasn't it?
Massively. Mill was mostly thinking about direct physical harm or maybe property damage. Today we talk much more about psychological harm, emotional distress, the harms of systemic discrimination, hate speech.
Which makes applying the principle much harder.
Much harder. Where's the bright line when you include psychological or societal harms? It's way more complex. And then you have the offense principle, the idea that maybe speech should be limited if it's just deeply offensive.
Mill wasn't keen on that.
No, he generally rejected limiting speech just because it offends someone, though others argue that severe offense, depending on context, motive, and how unavoidable it is, might warrant some limits. But it's a much weaker justification than preventing harm.
The source also mentions toleration theories.
Yeah, thinkers like Lee Bollinger and others argue that protecting even speech we hate actually helps build a more tolerant society. It forces us to develop self-restraint, it might help neutralize bad ideas by exposing them, and it keeps the state out of the business of deciding which offensive ideas are too offensive.
But not everyone agrees free speech is this special overriding right.
No, there are critiques. Some question if it should automatically trump other values, like equality or dignity. especially when speech causes harm. Others argue the value of speech isn't abstract. It depends on the context. What's appropriate in science is different from friendship, which is different from legal testimony.
So maybe different types of speech deserve different levels of protection, political versus artistic versus commercial.
Exactly. The justifications might vary, and so might the need for limits. It complicates the idea of a single unified theory.
Which leads us squarely into the really tricky part, navigating that fine line. Where are the limits, how is speech abused, and why is it always so controversial?
Yeah, that fine line is, well, it's blurry, it moves, and everyone disagrees on where it is. The source stresses how subjective and contested it is. It changes across cultures, legal systems, time periods.
Like hate speech, no single definition works everywhere.
Especially not in the U.S. legal context compared to, say, Europe or Canada. Whether something crosses the line depends so much on context, intent, impact. It's rarely simple.
Okay, but legally, especially in the U.S., there are categories of speech that definitely aren't protected, right?
Yes, there are several well-defined, though narrowly interpreted categories. First, incitement to imminent lawless action, the Brandenburg test. It has to be directed at causing illegal acts right now and be likely to do so. High bar. True threats, serious expressions of intent to commit violence, making a reasonable person fear for their safety. The Supreme Court recently clarified this requires showing the speaker acted with at least recklessness regarding the threatening nature.
Fighting words.
That's another category from the Chaplinsky case, but it's very limited now. Basically, face-to-face insults likely to provoke an immediate fight. Rarely applied today.
And obscenity.
Yes, defined by the Miller test. Appeals to prurient interest, is patently offensive by community standards, and lacks serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific value. Again, a high standard.
What about things like lying?
Defamation libel, written, and slander, spoken, involves false statements of fact that harm someone's reputation. There's a higher bar, actual malice for public figures, established in New York Times v. Sullivan.
Okay.
Also unprotected. Child pornography, categorically unprotected. Fraud and perjury, knowingly false statements for gain or under oath, false advertising, speech that's integral to committing a crime like a robber's demand, and copyright infringement.
So those are the clear legal lines, mostly, but the source talks about taking advantage speech that's legal but still problematic.
Exactly. And this is where so much controversy lies. Hate speech is a prime example in the U.S. It's often deeply harmful, targets vulnerable groups, creates hostile environments. But unless it meets the definition of incitement or true threats, it's generally protected.
Which is different from many other places.
Very different. International law and many democracies have broader restrictions on hate speech, trying to balance free expression with equality and non-discrimination. It's a major tension point.
And misinformation, disinformation, fake news.
Another huge area. Misinformation is unintentionally false. Disinformation is deliberately deceptive. Malinformation is using truthful info to cause harm. In the U.S., even false factual statements are generally protected unless they fall into defamation or fraud. There's deep skepticism about letting the government be the arbiter of truth.
But the impact can be massive.
Absolutely. Political manipulation, foreign interference, eroding trust, polarization, even inciting violence. Social media algorithms often amplify this stuff. It's a serious challenge.
Online harassment and cyberbullying fit in here too.
Yes. Things like persistent unwanted contact, doxing, impersonation, non-consensual sharing of intimate images. The law is still catching up. It's hard to craft laws that stop the harm without being overly broad and chilling legitimate speech. Often the focus shifts to regulating the conduct rather than the content itself.
And lawful but awful.
That captures a lot of it. Speech that's offensive may be cruel, may be harmful in a broader sense, but doesn't cross those specific legal lines. A huge headache for online content moderation.
What about just plain offensive speech?
Generally protected in the U.S., based on Mill's rejection of the offense principle as a primary limiter. But, as we discussed, the line between offensive and genuinely harmful, like harassment or threats, can be blurry and context-dependent.
This makes me think about comedians. They often seem to walk right up to that line, or deliberately cross it. Is there no fine line between a joke and something serious for them?
That's a fascinating question. Legally, satire and parody get pretty broad protection in the U.S., especially as forms of criticism or commentary. The Hustler v. Falwell case is key. A parody, even a vicious one, isn't defamatory if no reasonable person would think it's stating actual facts.
But they definitely push boundaries.
That's often the point, right? To provoke thought, laughter, social critique. But it also means they frequently face backlash, threats, sometimes even violence.
And comedians often argue that trying to draw sharp lines kills the comedy, "it was just a joke" defense.
Yes, because humor often relies on ambiguity, playing with taboos, subverting expectations. They argue that scrutinizing every joke for potential offense stifles creativity and critique.
But context matters hugely.
Absolutely. Who's telling the joke, who's the audience, the cultural moment. It all affects perception. And social media means reactions are instant and amplified. Many comedians talk about self-censorship now.
Are there still ethical considerations, though?
Of course. Questions about punching down versus punching up, the impact on vulnerable groups, normalizing harmful stereotypes versus challenging them. These are ongoing debates within comedy itself.
And legal limits still apply?
Yes. A joke isn't a free pass for defamation, if presented as fact, incitement, true threats, or obscenity.
AI must have trouble with jokes, too.
Big trouble. Understanding nuance, irony, satire. That's really hard for current AI, making automated content moderation of humor very challenging.
So when does a joke go too far? Beyond comedy, just in general conversation, aggression, fights, gossip, even predictions?
It's incredibly subjective, isn't it? It
Okay.
depends on so many things. The speaker's perceived intent, the actual words and tone, the context, the relationship between people, and how it lands with the listener.
The potential harm.
Can be very real. Emotional distress is harm. Reputational damage from gossip presented as joke is harm. Jokes that escalate into verbal aggression or seem like threats can be harmful. Even predictions, if framed as jokes, can spread misinformation or stereotypes.
Gossip is interesting. If it's false, it could be defamation.
Potentially, yes, if it's a false statement of fact that harms someone's reputation. But even truthful gossip can damage relationships and trust.
And aggression.
Jokes used aggressively can easily cross into fighting words or even perceived threats, depending on the situation.
What about the listener's perspective? Someone taking things too seriously.
That's part of the subjectivity. Someone's sensitivity, their past experiences, might make them perceive something as an attack or threat when the speaker didn't intend it that way. It's a minefield sometimes.
Okay, zooming out again. Given all this complexity, all these competing values and blurry lines, why is freedom of speech so controversial consistently?
I think it boils down to a few core reasons. First, it forces us to confront clashes between fundamental values we hold dear. Liberty versus equality, expression versus dignity, free inquiry versus safety and order, individual rights versus community well-being. There are rarely easy answers when these collide.
And power dynamics play a huge role.
Absolutely. Who gets to speak? Whose voice gets heard and amplified? Who gets to define the limits? Speech is undeniably a tool of power, used both to maintain dominance and to challenge it. Debates about free speech are often implicitly debates about power structures.
The definition of harm is also contested.
Constantly. Is it only direct physical injury? What about psychological distress, reputational damage, systemic harm to groups, erosion of social trust? Establishing clear causal links between speech and these broader harms is really difficult and debated.
Politics gets involved too, obviously.
Massively. Freedom of speech is often instrumentalized in political battles. Accusations of censorship fly from one side, while accusations of abuse or hate speech fly from the other, often based more on political alignment than consistent principle.
Economic factors.
Yes, things like corporate speech rights, campaign finance, does money equal speech? Does wealth give some speakers undue influence in the political marketplace? These are big economic dimensions to the debate.
And even in just everyday life.
We self-censor all the time, don't we? For
Oh.
tact, politeness, maintaining relationships. Those informal norms are crucial, but also represent a kind of restriction.
There's also the tension between stability and progress.
Right. Fear that bad speech will tear society apart versus the fear that restricting speech will stifle necessary dissent and prevent positive change.
And the slippery slope argument often comes up.
Always. The concern that once you start restricting some speech, even with good intentions, it becomes easier and easier to restrict more and more, eventually eroding the principle itself.
You mentioned speech virtues earlier. Is the controversy partly because we lack those?
I think that's a huge part of it, as the source suggests. The marketplace of ideas really only works if people engage with listening, respect, humility, rationality. Without those virtues, it just becomes a shouting match. Or worse, reinforces existing inequalities because marginalized voices aren't genuinely heard. This idea of epistemic injustice is relevant here, whose knowledge and perspective is even considered valid.
So powerful actors can take advantage by just dominating the space.
Yes, exploiting their access and resources to shape the narrative, sometimes drowning out critical perspectives. Achieving a truly equitable speech landscape is a massive challenge.
Even how we talk about history seems related.
Definitely. Shaping historical narratives is an ongoing site of struggle. Freedom to interpret the past versus harmful historical denialism. The ethics of historical speech are incredibly complex.
Okay, the source then breaks things down by specific sectors, looking at how these dilemmas play out in practice. It seems like a recurring theme emerges.
Yes, it's this constant balancing act. Upholding free speech principles while dealing with real-world power imbalances and the vulnerability of certain groups or processes. And digital technology just pours gasoline on both the potential benefits and the potential abuses.
And trying to fix harms often creates new free speech worries.
That's the cyclical dilemma. You try to curb misinformation, and suddenly you're accused of censorship. You try to protect protesters, and you face questions about public order.
Let's look at politics and governance first. What are the key tensions there?
It's the classic state power versus individual rights arena. Issues like outright state censorship, the need for government rules about speech to be viewpoint neutral, the right to protest versus reasonable restrictions on time, place, manner.
Avoiding the heckler's veto?
Right, not letting hostile audiences shut down a speaker. Plus, the challenges of modern political discourse, deepfakes, AI manipulation, logical fallacies used strategically, and always balancing security and order with protest rights, dealing with incitement, and now foreign interference online.
How about economics and corporate power?
Key issues there include ethics and advertising truthfulness, targeting vulnerable people. Then there's the huge debate around corporate speech, especially in politics, after decisions like Citizens United in the U.S. Is corporate money protected speech? Does it lead to undue influence?
Then whistleblowing.
That's another crucial one. Balancing the public interest in revealing wrongdoing against employee loyalty, potential retaliation, ensuring accuracy. It highlights how financial power can shape what information becomes public.
Health and well-being seems especially relevant after recent years.
Hugely. The tension between disseminating reliable public health information and countering harmful misinformation became incredibly stark during COVID-19. It raised questions about trusting official guidance versus individual judgment.
And the mental health impact.
Both positive and negative. Speech is vital for self-expression, finding community, building resilience. But exposure to hate speech, online harassment, the pressure to self-censor, that can take a heavy toll. Taking advantage here often means spreading harmful health misinformation for clicks or ideology.
Education is another battleground. Academic freedom, student speech.
Constantly debated. Academic freedom for teachers and researchers to explore topics without censorship is vital. But then you have student speech rights, landmark cases like Tinker v. Des Moines, allowing regulation only for substantial disruption, obscenity, or promoting illegal drugs. What about off-campus speech?
And the whole safe spaces versus challenging ideas debate.
Exactly. How do you foster critical thinking while also ensuring an inclusive environment? Plus, ongoing fights over censoring books or curriculum materials. And new debates like the proposed KOSA Kids Online Safety Act, protecting kids versus chilling effects, censorship, privacy concerns. It's about balancing rights with educational goals.
What about science and inquiry? Isn't free exchange fundamental there?
Absolutely fundamental. Open inquiry, debate, peer review. That's how science progresses. But there are tensions. Academic science versus corporate or military research with more restrictions. Concerns about government censorship of science for political reasons.
Protecting scientists themselves.
Yes, protecting them from harassment or politically motivated attacks is crucial. There are also ethical debates about certain research areas, dual-use technologies, balancing freedom of inquiry with safety and ethics, and ensuring the quality of scientific information shared with the public. Taking advantage here could be suppressing inconvenient findings or irresponsibly disseminating potentially dangerous research.
Arts and media seems like another obvious area.
Definitely. Artistic expression gets strong First Amendment protection in the U.S., but controversies constantly erupt over obscenity, using that Miller test. Defamation in fictional works, intellectual property, public funding for the arts often comes with strings attached.
And journalism.
Huge challenges there. The shift to social-first news, the pressure for virality, potentially compromising accuracy, the whole fake news disinformation problem, eroding public trust. And critically, the safety of journalists facing attacks, arrests, online harassment globally. Taking advantage can mean state censorship, public pressure leading to self-censorship, or media prioritizing engagement over truth.
How does speech play out in conflict zones?
It's a double-edged sword. Speech can be a powerful instigator of conflict propaganda, dehumanization, incitement to violence. We see censorship often increase during wartime. But free and reliable information is also crucial for resolving conflict, for accountability, understanding different perspectives, countering hate speech post-conflict. International law tries to balance security needs with protecting expression and media workers in conflicts.
Environmental issues, too.
Speech is essential for raising awareness, debating policy, holding polluters accountable, and environmental justice movements. Media freedom is key, but environmental defenders often face serious threats, violence, strategic lawsuits, SLAPPs, designed to silence them. There's also a chilling effect on climate change speech due to organized attacks and pressure on platforms. Suppressing information or silencing critics is definitely taking advantage here.
Finally, the source highlights indigenous communities. How is free speech relevant there?
It's deeply linked to cultural survival, land rights, self-determination, and combating discrimination. Historically, their rights to speak their languages, practice their cultures, and govern themselves were often denied through assimilation policies.
And contemporary struggles.
They often involve fighting for self-determination, preserving cultural heritage, including languages, activism around land, and environmental protection. They face challenges from state and corporate interests trying to silence them, and the persistence of derogatory imagery like mascots.
Is there growing recognition of their specific rights?
Yes, there's increasing recognition in international law and some domestic contexts of collective rights related to heritage, traditional knowledge, and self-determination, which includes the freedom to express and maintain their distinct cultures. Taking advantage here involves suppressing these rights, perpetuating harmful stereotypes, or undermining their sovereignty.
Wow, okay, that covers an incredible amount of ground. This has truly been a deep dive. If listeners take away just a few key things, what should they be?
I think first, just recognizing the sheer complexity. Freedom of speech isn't simple or absolute. It's got this rich, long history, complex philosophical roots, and its limits are always being debated and redrawn.
And it's not just about laws.
Definitely not. Culture, society, context, they matter just as much, if not more sometimes, than the legal text. How we actually practice free speech is shaped by norms and attitudes.
And that fine line.
It's not fixed. It's a moving target, a constant negotiation between individual expression and other crucial values like safety, dignity, and equality. There are no easy answers.
All right, so to leave everyone with something to chew on, here's a final thought. Think about those different philosophical reasons why we protect free speech. Is it mostly about finding truth? Or enabling democracy? Or is it more fundamental to just being human, to our autonomy?
Which of those resonates most with you? And how does that shape your view on where the limits should be? In different situations online, in politics, in art?
And maybe consider how all this gets even more complicated with AI creating content, algorithms shaping what we see, and our digital lives becoming so central. How do these new technologies change these very old questions?
Definitely a lot to think about. It's a conversation that's not ending anytime soon.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.